Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, as I've been introduced. Today I would like to talk to you about the subject international consumer policy in an international context. I put together basically two packages. The first part will focus on the international consumer policy framework is what I call it. So we're going to be looking at some global economic data. What are the consumers that we're talking about when we're looking at a global perspective? I will introduce some selected international institutions, multilateral institutions, government level, non-government. And then also, if time permits it, I'd like to stimulate a short debate about the WTO and the influence of the WTO on consumer issues. To provide a common ground for all of us, I selected a few world maps and statistics. This is a world map that shows each country according to the GDP. I think you all know what GDP is. Do you know what the PPP is, the purchasing power parity? Okay. That is very important to enable comparability between different countries, because many countries have different kinds of currencies, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're looking at here is the actual purchasing power comparison. So what we see here is that, of course, it's not a big surprise. The African continent has a very low purchasing power, but also countries like India, which alone has 1.2 billion population. China with 1.3 billion is also still, it's just barely green. So the overall population still has not that much of a purchasing power compared to, let's say, the typical Western countries. But, of course, there's growth. That means the GDPs change, and the purchasing power also changes. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, just released a press release last week indicating new numbers, slightly reduced growth perspectives for 2016 and 2017, and points out that especially the emerging market economies are facing challenges, and they specifically point out the risk that go along with China, the housing market there, the credit bubble that is presumed there is playing a critical role. So yeah, this further gives us an idea of what the global economy looks like. Another, important figure is, of course, trade. What's going on with trade? And so this is a map and some figures showing merchandise exports and imports, also in current US dollars, which is another form of saying it's equalized, it's balanced out so that we can compare it, and we can see that exports in Europe, according to 2013 numbers, have gone up 4%, North America up 2%, whereas in South America down 2%, Africa down 6%, Middle East down 1%. So yeah, we can get a slightly more detailed feeling about what's been going on in the last couple of years. On the global perspective, we can also look at imports that have been going up more or less everywhere. And we also get a feeling of the volume that is being traded in exports and imports in the different regions. So this is also here to provide us kind of a common understanding of how the world economy is looking like, how it's shifting. Okay, if we talk about consumers, of course, one of the more interesting questions is how does inflation look like? And this map basically provides us with an overview of how how the inflation situation is in all the countries. As you are all aware, inflation rates in Europe, in the US, are very, very low. In some cases, even just cutting the zero, maybe even towards deflation at some point. And there are actually some countries, those are the blue ones, that are actually facing real deflation, meaning decreasing overall prices measured by a basket of products. Now, this is, of course, very important when we talk about consumption and consumers, because the individual consumer has a certain amount of money, and the value of the money versus the prices of goods and products have a strong impact on the purchasing power. So, who are the world consumers? This is an image that I selected, and I like it a lot because it basically separates or basically distinguishes between the top of the economic pyramid. We can see sailing boat, a nice open sports wagon. That's what the top 10% consumers are consuming. And then we have the let's say middle class consumer class here, which is more the picture here tries to illustrate more moderate types of consumption. But if we look to the bottom of the economic pyramid, that is where we see, and that is where most of the world's consumers are. That's what's actually going on down there. So to move away from the image and to look at it in a slightly more technical way, we have this pyramid here once again. Now, these numbers might not be very new, and the reason is because this whole concept and topic of the so-called base of the pyramid or base of the pyramid consumers is actually something that evolved after the millennium, and for some reason has not been followed up on. I don't know exactly why, but I like the concept, and it's very helpful to understand when we're looking at consumer policy from a global perspective, who are the actual consumers that we're looking at. And even though the numbers might not be 100% accurate anymore, the relationship or the ratio between the bottom of the pyramid versus the tier 2 and 3 versus the tier 1 are still more or less the same. So we're looking at something like roughly 4 billion consumers that are earning that have a very low household income. Another interesting perspective is, well, what is their structure of expenses? What is the structure of expenses at this BOP, at the bottom of the economic pyramid? So you can see that, more than half of the household expenditures is used for food, which of course makes them very vulnerable. You can see that housing only plays a minor role, energy, transportation, water 0.4%, but food is the main expenditure position in their expenditure structure. So that means that they're very vulnerable. They're vulnerable in many ways. If the purchasing power decreases, it strongly affects their basic need for food. Yeah, by the way, if there's any questions regarding understanding, please just feel free to give me a signal. Please, yeah.
What is the meaning of ICT next to transportation?
Information, communication, technology. Yeah. So who are the world's consumers? I think this slide provides slightly more better feeling of, the majority is right down here, 4 billion, and this is what their expenses structure looks like. Okay, now keeping in mind this global perspective, consumers have the means of influencing quite a lot. This is a very interesting illustration because it shows consumer influence on the micro level, which means on the individual level, and on the macro level, which means a compounded level, versus on politics and versus on markets. And yeah, it actually, when I saw this the first time, I was quite surprised because consumers actually do have, let's say, the potential of influencing markets and politics on an individual level and on a compounded level quite a lot. Of course, there's many reasons why it doesn't work like that, but we can see that, of course, consumers that are also citizens vote. They are individuals that are members of political parties. They can have their voice heard through opinion polls, articles in newspapers, and of course word of mouth is also something that is important. And if we look on the market level, of course the individual shopping behavior is important. There are complaining options. Individual shopping behavior like boycotts, if somebody doesn't agree with the policy of a certain company and decides not to purchase any of the company's products anymore, word of mouth equally. And of course consumers also influence other consumers. That is basically also what word of mouth can mean. And if we go to the macro level, well, of course consumers are members of political parties, so the parties themselves, as you know, play a big role. Consumer organizations, other organizations that tackle consumer issues like environmental organizations, and they influence government parliaments, which then translates into influencing the size of taxes or even the subject of taxes, legal regulation, norms, standards, education. And then consumer organizations themselves, of course, being legal bodies who represent a larger group, can organize larger scale activities like organized boycotts. And yeah, they strongly, at least in countries like Germany, they strongly can influence industry and trade, product development and competition. All right. Now, looking at the globe, there are various multilateral government, non-government institutions that either cover consumer policy dedicatedly, directly, or as in the case of the World Trade Organization, they don't cover it directly, but rather influence consumer issues, consumer policy in an indirect way. And this list of organizations, I put it together, I selected it because I think that, yeah, if we have a look at them, which we will now, that will give us a better understanding of how the consumer policy setup looks like on a global level. All right, well, the United Nations, I did not choose to go into detail about who the United Nations are and how they work, because I assume that is common knowledge. I assume all of you have heard of the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection. Yeah, that's a first meaningful document from the UN, which was published in 1999 and then further expanded in 2003. And basically, these 8 fundamental or universal consumer rights that are encoded into that document and have been decoded by the Consumers International are the following: the right to basic needs, the right to safety, the right to choice, the right to information, the right to representation, the right to redress, the right to consumer education, the right to a healthy environment. Now these basically go along one-on-one with the consumer movement that was pushed by John F. Kennedy in the 60s, and well, you can see it took quite a lot of time to actually translate into a UN document, meaningful document. Okay, so these guidelines, they mention a number of threats and problems. And now the good thing about the United Nations, of course, they have a very unique perspective because, you know, almost each and every country of the world belongs to the UN, and that way the UN has access to a lot of information and also can consider, you know, the broad perspective of the of all the countries, including the so-called base of the pyramid, which of course are mostly, the base of the pyramid consumers are mostly found in countries that are not considered developed countries like Western countries, etc. So we have a whole list here of threats or problems that consumers all over the world face and that need to be protected from. We have, just to point out a few, adulteration of products. We have problems like if there is a, let's say in Ethiopia, for example, if there is a famine or something, then of course hoarding can become a problem, which then affects overall availability of products. Well, and then of course we have something that all of us have encountered, defective goods, and it doesn't matter if we here in Germany buy an electronic device or if a Indian buys an electronic device. If it's broken and it doesn't work, both the Indian consumer and the German consumer will want to have a solution for that problem. The question is, can each and every country offer a solution? Yeah, so that also goes along with non-fulfillment of guarantees or warranties, yeah, of course, in the credit card age, credit card frauds is something that I don't know. I've definitely been affected by it up to now. Okay, so the UN guidelines for consumer protection basically provide recommendations for the member countries, for the governments of the member countries to elaborate consumer policies and relevant legislations and effective regulations that guarantee physical safety, promote and protect consumers' economic interests, enable standards for the safety and quality of consumer goods. We'll come to standards a little bit later when we talk about ISO. Measures enabling consumers to obtain redress, education and information programs, promotion of sustainable consumption is of course something that has become more and more important over the past decades. So this was a quick introduction to the UN guidelines of consumer protection. Yeah, I would now like to move on to Consumers International, and I'm sure one or the other of you has also already encountered this institution. Consumers International is basically the top level consumer organization. It has 240 member consumer organizations that are spread out over 120 countries, which means that they also have a very global perspective on what consumer issues and consumer problems are. Yeah, so they call it World Federation of Consumer Groups. It was founded in 1960 with the headquarters in UK, London, and it's of course a non-for-profit company. And what it basically does, it provides global advice to its members, and they also every now and then provide a new strategy. The newest strategy that Consumers International has formulated now has the subtitle Unlocking Consumer Power on a Global Scale. Obviously they're representing consumers, and they're trying to find new ways and new approaches on how to really have the consumer voice heard in a stronger way within the global markets and global economies. So I put together from their website their vision. Consumer International's vision is of a world where people can make informed choices on safe and sustainable goods and services in which individual and collective consumer rights are secure and respected. And then here we see some more, points that are important for Consumers International. And then, of course, besides a vision, they always also have a mission. And so to champion consumer rights internationally in order to help protect and empower consumers everywhere. Obviously, as a lobby group on the global level, they really, have to make some powerful statements. And I just think it's interesting to, get a quick, brief overview about their mission as well. Okay. If we now look on a different, to a different organization, there's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. I'm sure most of you have heard about it as well. Also founded in 1960, the headquarters is located in Paris. And the map here shows you the member structure in the world. The dark blue colors, which shows basically European countries and North American countries, those were the original founding members, and then in the 90s and 2000s other countries joined as well, Mexico, Chile, Australia, Japan. So the OECD is a government cooperation institution. You have the members, you have the countries that are members, the member governments cooperate here, and on the left you can see their governance structure. There's a council that provides oversight and strategic direction. They have various committees that of course do all kinds of topics. We'll look at one committee afterwards. And there's the secretariat that provides analysis, etc. So the OECD, besides covering all kinds of other policy areas, you can see the slogan of the OECD is better policies for better lives. So basically the OECD covers all kinds of policy areas, development, economic, social, environmental. So I just selected this one committee that is relevant for our today's class here, which is the Committee on Consumer Policy, the CCP. So OECD was established in 1960. This committee was established in 1969, which means that it took about almost 10 years until consumer policy actually made it onto OECD's agenda. And brings together senior consumer policy and enforcement officials from the various OECD governments. They have biannual meetings and public workshops. And of course, they also have a mission, which I am illustrating here. Consumer policy aims at strengthening the performance of markets by providing protection for consumers from fraudulent or misleading commercial practices and from unsafe products. Empowered consumers spur business to innovate and thus drive competition and productivity. Here are four methods of how these consumer policies can be enhanced: carrying out research and analysis on topics of common interest, exchanging information on current and emerging issues and trends, developing guidelines and policy principles for addressing problematic areas, and examining ways to strengthen policy outcomes through law enforcement cooperation between governments and with other stakeholders. So you can already see this working approach is much more government-oriented, simply because the members are governments, and the people that work together here are, besides stakeholders that come from the consumer community, we're mostly looking at a government exchange that is happening here. Okay, the OECD has a nice document called the OECD Consumer Policy Toolkit. And this is the 6-step approach of efficient and good practice consumer policy making. The first step involves defining the problem and figuring out what the source is. The second step is trying to validate or measure how serious the problem is, what is the magnitude, how much of a threat is it to society and to consumers. And then the next step is, okay, is action required? What kind of issue are we looking at? What kind of new policy might have to be introduced? What kind of policy options in detail? Of course, there are always many ways how to tackle certain problems. Evaluating the different options according to their efficiency, according to how serious the problem is, and then finally, developing a policy review process. And at the end comes the final decision if a new policy will actually be, translated into action or not. Also from the OECD Consumer Policy Toolkit, we can see here just a nice, not so complicated framework of policy tools, structured according to demand-side tools and supply-side tools, as well as some in the middle. So on the supply side, of course, standards is an important issue. Licensing and accreditation, or certain products can also just be prohibited as a final resolve. On the demand side, education and awareness initiatives, or also contract terms regulation is an important topic. And then we also find things that cut through the middle. Dispute resolution and redress in the case that consumers and businesses sort of enter into a conflict, and various financial instruments, including taxes, etc. If you think about the tobacco industry and the fact that smoking is not very healthy, and that's a very, very valid. That would be a very valid financial instrument. Okay, so that was a quick look at the OECD and the committee and the OECD policy toolkit. What else is there? On the European level, there is a kind of a equivalent to Consumers International. There's BEOC, which is basically a European consumer organization, a member-based organization. So we have BEOC, and its members are all consumer organizations from European countries. You can consider it a regional consumer umbrella organization. And yes, there are also other regional consumer membership organizations in other parts of the world, in the ASEAN region or in the Americas, etc. You can see that in the 60s, a lot of things were going on. A lot of institutions were founded. So the same is true for BEOC. It was founded in 1962. The headquarters are in Brussels. And BEOC was actually the first lobbying institution located in Brussels. Of course, nowadays, I'm sure you're aware, Brussels basically, I think it has a population of 1 million, and maybe 25% are lobbyists that are living in Brussels because they want to try to influence the policy-making process on the EU level. And they also, of course, have a mission. It is BEOC's mission to bring together consumer organizations of the European Union and other European countries in order to promote, defend, and represent the interests of European consumers in the elaboration and implementation of European Union policies. Of course, the focus here is on the European Union. And by the way, I'm not going into detail here now on the European Union as an individual institution. Obviously, the European Union also focuses much on consumer policy, and because of the concept of unified market in the European Union, free movement of goods, of capital, and of people, consumer policy is something that is mostly decided and regulated on the European level. So meanwhile, consumer policy is quite similar in all the EU countries, although the implementation of the policy might differ from country to country. BEUC supports the empowerment of consumers through competitive markets, but complemented by health and safety, safeguards, etc. Okay, and what does BEUC do? If you have any question, by the way, please feel free to just bring it up. Yeah, so the members decide on BEUC's priorities and objectives during the General Assemblies, and basically, yeah, lobbying towards the EU, and BEUC focuses on selected priorities which include financial services, food, consumer rights and enforcement, sustainability issues, health, safety and energy. Any need for clarification? All right. Okay. Another institution that doesn't have the word consumer in its name is the International Organization for Standardization, founded earlier than in the 60s, actually right after the Second World War, 47. Headquarters located in Geneva. And, well, it's a similar concept. ISO is the international standards body whose members are the national standards bodies of each country. So, for example, in Germany, we have the DIN, which is the German body for standardization, and in the United States there's ANSI, for example. So there's 162 national standards body that are members. It's a non-governmental international organization and brings together all the knowledge and expertise of all the different countries in the field of standardization. On the right side we can see their governance structure. They also have a General Assembly, they have the Council, and what is also very important is that they have Council standing committees. We'll look at one of the committees in more detail in a few moments. What is also important are the technical committees. The technical committees are the actual committees where different experts, engineers from all kinds of different fields sit together and work on the actual standards documents. So if it's a standard about electronic production process, then you'll have electronic engineers, etc., sitting together. And if it's a food safety related standard, then you'll have food technologists sitting together, etc. ISO standards and consumers. So yes, so actually, like the common understanding is, oh well, ISO only has to do with standards and consumers don't really play an important role, but that is actually not the truth. ISO themselves consider themselves as a very important institution for consumers. In fact, when you visit their webpage, I think you can even find the topic right at the very beginning. And okay, let's first look at what is a standard. Has anybody of you ever worked with a standard before? Like a management standard for quality management or something, ISO 9000?
In my company, when I used to work, I worked in 2 companies that they belong to this system. I don't know if the same, because it's a company.
Okay.
They worked with ISO standards.
Okay, do you by any chance remember what kind of ISO standards you were working with?
It's 9000.
Okay. Yeah.
The other one, 12,000, I think.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The standard 14,000.
Yeah. Yeah, so those are very common so-called management process standards. ISO 9000 is a quality management system standard, and 14,000, for example, is an environmental protection system standard or environmental management standard. Yeah, so a standard is a document that provides requirements, specifications, guidelines, or characteristics that can be used consistently to ensure that materials, products, processes, and services are fit for their purpose. And since their existence, ISO has published more than 20,500 international standards that can be either purchased directly from ISO or from their members. So the logic is that international standards are developed on the ISO level and are then disseminated to their members, to Germany, to France, to Ethiopia, to India, so that a common ground is provided on a global level. That makes trade and production, etc., much easier. Please.
So I have a question between ISO certification. Is it given only for product services, or also to at the managerial level of the company?
Both, yeah, both. Like these systems that we were just speaking about, ISO 9000, it's a quality management system, a standardized, internationally standardized quality management system. And it covers the entire quality management process throughout a company, and there are own within larger production companies. There are own dedicated quality managers. I mean, they're typically part of the. They can even be part of the extended management group, for example. Okay, well, let's look at how these standards are developed and what role the consumers play. So, now, when these standards are developed, integrating the view of the consumer is important, and that is actually what ISO has already recognized. So, in these technical committees that I mentioned earlier, you don't only have the engineers and the production experts, but they actually include consumer representatives into these committees as well, to make sure that the standards don't only meet the producer's needs and the production processes needs, but also the consumer needs. I mean, regarding the products and products being the final outcome on the market. Maybe this will answer your question even more. So there is also a committee at ISO that is called the Committee on Consumer Policy, CUPOLCO. And CUPOLCO undertakes a range of activities to promote and encourage consumer interests and standards. It decides on the most effective areas of focus for consumer participation and standards. It is well recognized that consumer integration into the standardization process is an important thing, and this doesn't only happen on the ISO on the international standardization level, but also ideally on the national level, because what happens in reality is that different countries, and Germany, by the way, is one of the largest standards developer in the world. So the DIN, which is located in Berlin, develops all kinds of standards related to the unique economy. Yeah, I mean, of course, the activity of a national standards body reflects the unique composition of each individual economy. Yeah, so the French standardization activities are certainly different from the German ones. The German ones, for example, has also a lot of focus on the car industry, simply because Germany is a large car producer. Other countries that have other different focal points in their economy produce standards with a different focus on different sectors. So what happens is these standards are developed on a national level, and then they're brought into ISO, and then all the countries discuss together if it makes sense to transfer or translate that national standard into an international standard. And then once that has been agreed upon, that is then disseminated to all other countries who agree and are willing to work with it. That has been recognized. Properly integrating the consumer's perspective helps to ensure that products and services perform as expected and that they also improve. Regarding quality and reliability, consistency in the delivery of services, choice and fair competition, transparency in production information is also a very crucial thing, especially if you think about sustainability issues where we as modern and educated consumers, we want to know where has it been produced, how has it been produced, was child labor involved, yes or no, has it been produced environmentally in an environmentally sound way, etc., etc. So those are things that are defined in these standards as well. Now we're coming to the World Trade Organization. And so the World Trade Organization was founded in 1995 as a successor institution to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, that was established also after the Second World War. And here on the map you can see, so basically the entire world is already a member of the WTO, except the yellow ones that are pointed out here. Ethiopia, for example, has been going in a several-year-long negotiation process of becoming a member. Russia just entered, just recently, actually, and so has Kazakhstan. Actually, the last time I held a presentation that involved this slide here, I had to update this map because Kazakhstan had just entered the WTO very recently. But I can see that Morocco is already a member. Do you by any chance know when Morocco joined? Okay, all right. Yeah, but yeah, you can see that North African countries here are still either in the process or are not joining yet. Middle Eastern countries. Yeah, so basically the World Trade Organization, if you want to talk about vision and mission, etc., it's not about consumer policy or something like that. It's about fostering trade. It's about making trade more efficient, reducing tariffs, etc. And then, of course, dispute settlement between member governments is one of the very important tasks if one government has the feeling that another government is not paying attention to its obligations, to the terms of trade. Then a dispute settlement process is moderated by the WTO. Yeah, there are a number of multilateral agreements that have been implemented over the past years. This is the most famous one, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which was actually the predecessor agreement before the WTO actually was founded. Trade in services was something that was recognized as being more increasingly important. Anti-dumping agreement, the dispute settlement undertaking agreement. And then the trade policy review mechanism is actually quite an interesting one because it basically involves the whole analysis of countries who want to join the WTO and have to meet certain requirements. The WTO is quite precise about what kind of requirements have to be met, and then there's also some so-called plurilateral, which means it's not a big number of countries, but just a small, that have to do with public procurement, for example. That is important because in the past, of course, there's this strong tendency in public procurement that, if the government of the Philippines wants to procure, it has an interest in procuring, homemade products and not foreign-made products. But of course, that doesn't work entirely because certain products, for example, airplanes or things like that, are not available from the local market. So, procurement is something that, and it has a large business volume. I mean, when governments buy airplanes, for example, that also, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there's also a specific agreement on trade and civil aircraft. What is important is that all of these treaties and agreements go along with a serious amount of regulatory as well as product process and management system standards requirements. Regulation in the past decades, of course, differed strongly between each of the countries, and the WTO tries to get these regulations harmonized to make trade more easier, so that a product that is imported or exported from A to B doesn't have to go through so many testing and certification processes, etc. But if it's certified in any place in the EU, then it is also recognized in any place in the EU, for example. That is what the EU market has achieved meanwhile. Now, why are we talking about the WTO if actually the WTO doesn't have any role to play in consumer policy? Well, simply because the implementation of multilaterally agreed upon international trade rules can have negative effects on many social issues, including protection of consumer rights, consumer policy as such. Now, internationally, there are two opposing views, obviously, on the WTO's effects and the effects of its interventions. Some argue that the WTO actually undermines consumer protection goals, and others think in the opposite direction. So, I prepared just a very short handout. Yeah, so I'd like you to have a look at these 4 slides. The top 2 describe the results of a study by Tien, who did this study on behalf of Consumers International in 2012, which is position A. The WTO undermines consumer protection goals. And the bottom 2 slides cite the main findings of a study that was done 10 years earlier by the ETH Zurich. So I'd like you to read this, have a look at it. If there's any questions, we can answer the questions. And then I would like to have a debate with you about the one side and the other. What do you think? Just exchange some views and some ideas. So, how is it going with the... So we have the 2 sides here. One side says, well, definitely, consumer protection goals are undermined by WTO membership and increased trade, etc. And the other side says, well, no, we don't really think so. What else do you see in this? In these texts? What other issues are raised in this text? Or variables?
I would say developing countries, because for developed countries it's sort of easier to implement like a gender policy sort of way, and for developing countries they still need to find a way, like not all of the factories or parts of the economy they can grow to the same size at the same time, so we have to equalize it sort of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, developing countries is definitely exactly what I was looking at when I was asking this question. That's one crucial other variable that is mentioned on the second slide on the top right. Also the fact that the consumer protection systems in developing countries are also not so efficient. And that is also, by the way, something that, from my experience, having worked, in 5 different regions in the world, looking at many different consumer protection systems, that is actually my feeling as well. Are there any other points that seemed important to you? Oh yeah, please.
Well, this is the already set worked in developing countries or less developed countries, as these regulations do not exist or they are not enforced, the consumers are less protected.
Yeah.
Like we are in the same situation where the markets are open to market to products from all over the world. The difference is that some markets are more vulnerable than others.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you say we, you're speaking about the Moroccan market, or general? Okay, yeah.
But I think that there is one example that I can share from Morocco.
Please do, yeah.
With the Chinese products that were able to enter the market, we can see that the quality, even the sanitary or even the environmental quality is not good, but they were able to enter the market.
Mm-hmm.
However, maybe we cannot see them in other developed countries, for example.
Yeah. All I can say is that the problem with Chinese products entering sub-Saharan African markets or North African markets is a huge problem. Huge, because the market surveillance systems are just often not efficient enough. They don't have the capacity to check each and every product, and so that is actually a real big problem.
The standardization in the developed countries is well set up compared to the developing countries.
Yeah.
They control it better and they reduce the entrance of harm.
Yeah. Although that now would not be a question of standardization, because of course standards per se are available more or less everywhere. The question is, are they used? And in this case, you have products that are being produced in China that are not using standards and that are then being exported into countries where the market surveillance and the cross-border surveillance regarding markets is just not efficient enough. Yeah.
Maybe that's the part of the consumer protection system that is not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another issue raised in the text is that apart from the governmental regulations and protection for the consumers, also how the consumers themselves perceive and react to whether they perceive the risks. And it was mentioned that public outrage can then increase the power of the consumers, but the thing is probably will they get the information that even there's a risk that they're faced with?
Now that is exactly the next question that I actually wanted to pose. Do you think that public outrage really is strong enough? Now, okay, maybe we can try to answer that question first for Germany and for the EU, but then try to answer that question from a Moroccan and maybe also, I'm sorry, it was Indonesia or Philippines, sorry, okay. So Filipino and Moroccan perspective. So public outrage, will that, how is it with public outrage? When did we have, what is a good example for public outrage in the markets in the past years in the European markets?
I would say it depends on the culture of the specific country. For example, a few years ago, I think in 2012, I've got a close friend in Portugal, and she was telling me about it, that it's really new that people go to the streets for young people to get jobs, because they don't have the culture of protesting or outrage. So normally they're just at home and they nod and they just don't do anything against the government. But then in 2012 it was for the first time that people actually went to the streets. And I think in Germany it's more common that people go to the streets to protest for something.
So we already can see we're talking about something that goes deeply into questions of governance, democracy, the role of citizens as such. Yeah.
Also the weight of civil society.
Exactly. Yeah.
Policy making.
Yeah.
Is it really powerful? Maybe it's powerful in Germany, but not as powerful in other countries.
I was just thinking about the example with TTIP. There was a big demonstration some months ago, and I don't know. I think it's difficult. I don't know, to change or to avoid it, that this trade agreement will be productive. We'll have it anyway, but at least we can change the conditions or try to get some more information when we say something against it.
Mm-hmm.
We just make it that we are not okay with, I don't know, these secret, secret meetings.
By the way, I purposely did not include the TTIP discussion into the presentation. It would fit in very well, but it's a whole own big discussion, which is so. We don't have the space for that, unfortunately. Any other findings or interesting points that you would like to get back to with regards to these two publications?
I just found it interesting that the support for position B was using the EU, which is a developed area, whereas the argument of the other position lies on the fact that it is different for developing countries.
Exactly, that's exactly it. Yeah.
So it seems like having maybe these multilateral agreements that are so broad-ranging, once you set an agreement, you think, okay, it's going to have these benefits and these consequences, but then once you apply them, they actually have different benefits and consequences to different extents. And I think the worst part is that in developing countries, the benefits are less and the consequences are more.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so if I would put it down to a vote here, who's for position A, that the WTO undermines consumer protection goals? I can count 4. Oh, now everybody. Oh, that's what I call dynamics. Okay. Okay. How about our Dutch student?
I'm not sure actually still.
Okay.
So that's why I keep myself from voting.
What is it that makes it difficult to or difficult for you to decide on that?
I think it's a bit of both.
Okay.
I think that I'm not sure how to explain it, but
Well, actually, your answer is perfectly fine because I think the truth is pretty much close to that. My experience is that whenever you talk or think multilaterally, you always have the challenge of trying to put one umbrella over so many different countries, economies, cultures, etc. So it's very hard to have either one way or the other way position on this one. And of course, it's quite obvious the WTO does go along with benefits for consumers in the EU, for example, or in the United States, or in Japan. But yeah, when it comes to developing countries, then it becomes a little more difficult. And my position and the second part will focus on consumer protection, consumer policy projects in developing countries. Is that the consumer protection and policy is just not as efficient, and therefore in developing countries the consumers do suffer more gravely than in the Western economies. Any other final remarks or points regarding this topic? Okay, well then the final slide that I want to show you, maybe you can already feel it a little bit that okay, consumer protection is important. It should play even a larger role than it does. I think that's more or less true. The largest, most elaborate study comparing consumer policies all over, trying to compare consumer policies all over the world, is from 2002, and you can see that more than half on the top covers EU countries, and then the bottom ones covers North American countries and Australia and Japan. So again, where's the rest of the world here? That's something that one of the things that we can see here. And the other thing is that, and that of course has to do with the fact that this is back in 2002. If you look at the policy objectives that have been gathered from the status quo back in 2002, you can see that they're rather heterogeneous. I don't know, is it possible to read them from the back? It's quite hard, huh? I see, okay. So, yeah, we're looking at the United Kingdom. Yeah, they focus on policies seeing modern markets and confident consumers. Better? Yeah. Yeah, that was why I was hoping we can somehow, have a larger screen. Denmark, which is the second country, focus on product safety, on more information for consumers, cooperation between consumers and businesses. The third one, France, equilibrate relations between professionals and consumers. With professionals, they mean industry business, the industry business perspective. Focus on consumer protection. Germany, consumer policy to be treated as an integral part of general economic policy. Italy, focus on information and implementation of EU policies. Netherlands, informed choice for consumers, importance given to the existence of sound rules to support and protect the consumers without placing an undue burden on business. Now that is actually a very important point because that is actually the ultimate conflict and challenge, especially, let's say, also from the government perspective when you're trying to develop policy and implement policy that meets the needs of all the stakeholders. And then moving down to the lower area, the non-EU part, Australia, promotion of competition and fair trading. Now that's interesting. Now here's a study that compares consumer policy objectives, dedicatedly consumer policy objectives, and one of the core objectives of the policy in Australia in 2002 was promotion of competition and fair trading. Very interesting. Canada, provide a fair and efficient marketplace. USA, consumer information, prevent fraud, deception, unfair business practices in the marketplace. And then finally, Japan, ensure consumer protection and economic development at the same time. Now we've already moved closer to the actual reality. What we find is that the understanding of what consumer protection and policy is and what it's supposed to achieve differs. I mean, within EU countries, status quo 2002, all of them have different objectives, all of them have a different understanding, and then you move on to other countries, non-EU countries, and you can also find a multitude of understandings and perspectives on the topic. Now that is something, if you take that and then you start looking into the African world or other places where the topic is, even less evolved. It's just everybody thinks consumer protection and policy is something different. Market surveillance, is that part of consumer policy? Yes or no? Competition policy, is that part of consumer policy? Yes or no? So those are things that you find when you that's the thing that the study here has found. And that it clearly shows, and the practical experiences that I'll be showing you later on strongly supports these findings. What we can find, or the thing is, I don't know. Probably you've heard about the basic principles, consumer education, information. All those things in one of your previous classes, and so what you can see is that on the international level, and also from the perspective of these institutions, including the UN, including Consumers International, that it's all there, it's all arrived there, it's nothing new. The big variable or question is the actual implementation and the actual, yeah.
Except within the EU and the US and most of the developed countries, including Japan, how do these organizations work within developing countries, for example? Are they effective?
Which organizations?
Local organizations for consumer protection or consumer policy.
Now, of course, I don't want to make a generalized statement about all kinds of countries that I've never been to, but at least the ones that I've seen, if you look at the problem, look at a consumer organization. A consumer organization is an NGO, okay? It has very limited ways of funding, and then you have all kinds of countries, for example, including Russia, including Ethiopia. I think even a country like even Israel is now following that example, declaring NGOs who receive foreign funds as a foreign agent and are thus not allowed to operate anymore, either entirely or only operate based on the local funds that they receive. So we have NGOs who even in Europe have a problem getting enough funds. In Germany, it works rather well, and Germany is also one of the top examples that is basically shown all over the world. A consumer organization that is legitimate is not permitted to receive funds from the private sector. So that cuts off a large source of potential funds. Now these governments that I just mentioned decided to not allow them to receive foreign funds, which means that, well, all, let's say, international cooperation projects are also threatened, basically. Yeah? Ethiopia, that was a very clear case, for example. Yeah. And generally, the setup of a consumer organization is ideally supposed to generate its own income by, selling its advisory, selling its publications, selling product testing reports, etc. That all just barely works, okay here, but it's very difficult to set up that kind of a structure in countries where there's not enough money anyway, right? So, and consumers that are members of consumer organizations are also not the biggest funders, of course. I mean, sure, they might pay their annual fee or something, but that is definitely not going to help those kinds of organizations survive. Equally, consumers at the base of the pyramid, you remember the beginning of the presentation, they also don't have the money to pay a lot for advisory and for services. So that means that the actual funding foundation of these organizations is just incredibly weak in many of these countries that I've seen. I can see you're already getting into the more detailed things, and I'm glad, because the second part will be going into more detail, looking at some countries and also a lot of details. So I suggest we take a break now of 15 minutes. So why don't we meet back here together at something like just short before 12. And then we'll continue. Yeah. All right, thank you very much.